We're going to start from the premise that God gave the Torah to the Jews at Mount Sinai. If you don't start from that premise, you can't begin to discuss the whole question of whether or not at Sinai, God also gave over some sort of oral tradition.
Rabbi Kelemen's premise, that the Torah was given by God at Mount Sinai, has not been established, as we have previously demonstrated. In this video, we will simply be examining his arguments and adding some educational comments, to explain why his arguments are not sufficient to establish a divine oral law.
I'm going to point to 4 hints that in fact there must have been some sort of oral tradition given over at Mount Sinai along with the text of the Torah. The first hint is as follows. When you open up a copy of the Torah, what you'll find is that the book has apparent errors, spelling mistakes, grammatical errors, syntactical errors, textual contradictions, and not a few of them, quite a lot.
These issues have been noted by biblical scholars, and many have advocated simple answers. For example, variance arose in the text due to scribal errors. Hebrew grammar and spelling evolved and changed over time. And finally, different sources have been used to create the Torah, thus explaining why these textual problems and contradictions exist.
I'll give you an example. If you open up to the first verse of the book, it says there, Bereshis bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So you and I know that this verse should be translated as, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. But if you take a careful look at the way the verse is written, that's not what it says. Bereshit, that does not mean in the beginning. If you want to write in the beginning using the root, Resh Aleph Shin, you would write Bereshana. Bereshit is construct form. That means the first word of the Torah means in the beginning of Bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created heaven and earth. So the verse as it's written is grammatically incorrect. It means in the beginning of God created heaven and earth, and there is a word missing.
Rashi, Radak, and Ibn Ezra have argued that there is precedent in Hebrew grammar to explain this text without appealing to the oral tradition. One explanation is to read Bereshit as the beginning of time itself, which despite its construct form, doesn't require an additional word, just like we see in Isaiah 46 verse 10. Another explanation is to read Bereshit as when God began creating the heavens and the earth, as we see in Hosea 1 verse 2. One must remember that translation is an imperfect way of communicating the original language, and that even the best English translation will not be able to perfectly articulate the Hebrew without modification.
If you believe that God gave the Torah, you have to come to one of 2 conclusions. One possibility is that God is mentally retarded. The other possibility is that these are not flaws at all. That each one of these textual anomalies is really a purposeful, stylistic manipulation to hint to you about some deeper message that's happening there. Bereshis. With Reshis, Bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created heaven and earth. Open up a concordance, an index to biblical verses, and look at every place that the word Reshis appears as a noun. And what you'll find is that the word Reshis almost invariably means one of 2 things. The word Reshis either means the Jews, or it means the Torah. Plug these back into the verse and see what makes sense. With the Jews, God created heaven and earth. Well, that's impossible. The Jews weren't around at the time. With the Torah, God created heaven and earth. Now, this is a fascinating concept. What's being recommended here is that there's some kind of device called Torah. And with this thing, create heaven and earth. Now, this device called Torah then is really a nature-creating device. It created all of heaven and earth, all of nature. Theoretically, if I would take this thing and I would just turn it around and I would point this thing at myself and then click it on, in theory, I could go in and change my own nature. Comes the first verse of the Torah and says, in case you would like to argue, you know, I'm not cut out for Torah because I have a genetic inclination towards cruelty. So the guy says, listen, I'd love to be frum, but I can't be frum because, I'm just a cruel kind of guy. Comes the first verse of the Torah and says, don't worry about that, because you can go back in and reconstruct your own nature with the Torah, because the Torah is a nature-creating device. It turns out that the first verse of the entire book is the single most important verse in the book. And if it wasn't for that verse, no one would ever be bound by the Torah. And the apparent mistake is not really a mistake at all.
Obviously, worshippers in the synagogue wanted to be uplifted with homilies from the rabbi's sermon, not a boring lecture about grammar and textual criticism. This is why the Midrashim became so popular in rabbinic literature.
Hint number 2, until the 6th century CE, every copy of the Torah was a scroll that was unvocalized. There was no nikud, there were no vowels. Okay, now, Hebrew happens to be a language which is extraordinarily dependent on vocalization. And if you slightly change the vocalization, the exact same letters can mean something completely different. The Torah scroll would have been very, very difficult to read if you didn't have an oral tradition about how to read it. I'll give you an example. There's a verse in the book that says, don't cook a calf in its mother's chet lamed bet. Now that word chet lamed bet can be vocalized one of two ways. Either chalav, which means milk, or chalev, which means fat. A specific part of the fat on a specific part of the animal. Now, what did God forbid? Did he forbid cheeseburgers or fat burgers? Based on the text of the Torah, there's no way to tell. Now, it gets much worse than this. There's another verse in the Torah that reads as follows. Don't ever, ever, ever eat chet lamed bet. By the way, of course, when this is sent over to Moshe, when Moses first received the Torah and God said, write this down, Moses would have asked, by the way, God, what is this chet lamed bet? At which point God would have had to have said, well, it's whatever you want it to be. Or it's meat, or it's fat, or it's milk, or he had to say something. And this is one of dozens of examples in the book where if you change the vocalization, the meaning completely changes. Therefore, minimally, at Mount Sinai, when the Torah was given over, God had to tell the people how to pronounce the words. Because otherwise there was no way they could possibly observe the book.
There are many Semitic languages that also don't have vowel marks. Does that mean that the Phoenicians, Moabites, and Arabs also received an oral tradition at Sinai? Certainly not. Obviously, there are simple language rules and contextual clues that allow people to read the words. That said, let's examine Rabbi Kelemen's example. In Leviticus 3, the context discusses removing het lamed bet off of animal parts such as the entrails, kidneys, loins, and liver. This clearly demonstrates that we are talking about a prohibition on eating fat in verse 17. In the other text, where it states one may not cook a kid in its mother's het lamed bet, the context makes sense to support milk, given that we are talking about the relationship between a mother and her child. One might also argue that it would be illogical to forbid consumption of fat generally, only to add an additional prohibition for a weird scenario of someone cooking the forbidden substance together with a piece of meat.
Hint number 3. Is there such a thing as a convert to Judaism? Yes, there is. According to the written text of the Torah alone, how do you convert to Judaism? Not a word. So if somebody wants to convert, how do you know if they're Jewish or not? At Mount Sinai, God must have said that you do it with a prick and a dip, or you do it with, going blah, and spinning around in circles. He had to say something, or he could have said, do it however you want. Or do it like the local nation, or something. But if God said nothing, then you would never have any way of knowing who's a convert and who's not a convert. Therefore, at Mount Sinai, God must have said something about how a conversion works, even if that something was just make up whatever you want to make up. But he has to say something, how do you convert, because it doesn't say in the Torah. I'll give you another example. There's dozens of these. According to the written text of the Torah, is there such a thing as marriage? Yeah. Of course. A woman is only allowed to marry one man. How does a man and a woman get married? How do they do that? Doesn't say. How do you know if you're married? Maybe you get married to a man by passing him in a hallway. And you can only marry one man. You can't marry two, which means a woman has to live locked up in a closet. But don't lock the woman in a closet. Why? Because it could be the way you get married is by locking yourself in a closet. I'll give you another example. According to the Torah, is there such a thing as divorce? Yes. Yes, there is. And it even says how you do it. You give the woman a sefer kritut. How would you translate sefer kritut? It's a book of cutting off. Now, what is a book of cutting off? It's something very sharp that you throw at her. How does she know when she? Can you send it FedEx? Do you have to hand it to her? What are you writing there? Dinner was bad. Signed. Like, how do you know? How does the woman know when she's divorced? In the Torah, there are dozens of concepts and institutions which are mentioned. So we know they exist and they're part of Judaism, but they're nowhere defined. God would have had to have defined those concepts, otherwise practicing this religion is impossible.
Rabbi Kelemen is correct that we need a more nuanced legal system than just the simple words of the written Torah, but he forgets that the Torah explicitly documents that Moses, by the authority of God, established the Israelite judiciary. The duty of the judiciary is to take the basic principles that God gave in the written Torah and create proper legal definitions and regulations so that the Torah can be a functioning legal system. Now, let's review the examples provided by Rabbi Kelemen. A convert is a person who sincerely joins the chosen people. A married woman requires a public and official designation by her spouse. And a divorce document is a legal document that is proof of a terminated marriage. We understand the necessity and rationale of these principles. God wants sincere outsiders to have a chance to join His chosen people. He wants women to be loyal to their husbands, both privately and publicly, and He also wants there to be a way to end a first marriage and the woman to remarry without being accused of adultery. Given these basic principles, the courts must come up with standards as to what qualifies as sincerity for a convert, what qualifies as a public and official marriage, and what qualifies as a legal divorce document. Notice that none of this requires an oral tradition. All it requires is following the letter of the law for appointing judges who set standards based on their collective knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the Torah principles in a holistic way.
Okay, I'll give you one fourth and final hint. The written text of the Torah itself refers repeatedly to an oral tradition. I'll give you an example. When the Torah is talking about how to construct the Mishkan, the mobile temple, so the Torah says, when you want to build the ark, build it according to the tmuna that I showed you. As far as we know, there are no pictures in the Torah scroll. And yet, the book itself says, construct the ark according to the tmuna. It says, construct the altar according to the tmuna that I showed you. Verse after verse keeps referring to these pictures that God showed to Moses, which means there must have been something extra-textual that was given over to Moses.
The reason Moses didn't draw pictures of the ark and the altar in the Torah is simple. Making the ark and the altar was a commandment given only for Moses alone. There was simply no need to record or to pass down this information orally, since it's not an eternal law.
I'll give you another example. There's a verse in Deuteronomy that says, when you want to eat meat, slaughter the animal as I, God, taught you. Where in the Torah does it talk about shechita? If the Torah says you should slaughter the animal as I taught you, and nowhere in the written text is there instructions, then it must be that the instructions were passed along orally. When you start flipping through the Torah, as you go through the Torah this year, you'll see portion after portion where there are references to this oral tradition.
The verse actually says, as I have commanded you. This implies a previous commandment. Shadal says, it refers back on the written commandment in verse 16, which forbids eating blood.
I don't need a PhD to figure out who could possibly be carrying the oral tradition. It's got to be out there someplace, and there's only one group that could be carrying it. That leads to the whole question of corruption. But come on, I mean, Kelemen, let's be reasonable. Are you telling me that for 3,000 years, an oral tradition was passed father to son, teacher to student, and it's intact today? Haven't you ever played the game of telephone?